Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad to see this many of you here this evening. I'm Carly Solstrom. I'm the director of the Spring Creek Project and also the director of Art, Science, Humanities, and Technology Integration here at Prax. I would like to begin with some thanks, especially to OSU's Sustainability Double Degree Program for reaching out to Spring Creek Project over a year ago with the idea of bringing Sarah Jaquette Ray here. Special thanks to Erica Elliott and Deanna Lloyd for everything that they did to make tonight possible. The Sustainability Double Degree Program allows students working toward any major to earn a double degree in sustainability concurrently with the first degree. And so students from majors as diverse as business administration and public health, civil engineering, and art come together to learn and imagine a better world. It's really quite extraordinary. I would also like to thank OSU's Sustainability Office, the Contemplative Studies Initiative, and the Center for the Future of Forests and Society for supporting this lecture and for the really essential environmental work that they're doing on campus and in the world. So thank you. And finally, thanks to our beloved local bookstore, Grassroots Books and Music, for selling books in the lobby today. Yes. I'd like to invite all of you to hang out for a while after Sarah's talk. She'll be available in the lobby to sign books. And if you haven't spent time in the gallery and the arts corridor that's right outside this door, I invite you to do that as well. The exhibitions that are up right now both pertain to climate change and I think would probably be of interest to you. At the Spring Creek Project and at Prax, we bring together artists, writers, scientists, philosophers, and scholars to think about the most pressing environmental issues, not as technical problems, but as something we live inside of emotionally, ethically, and collectively. And many of you care deeply about climate change and biodiversity loss and social justice, and you don't need a class or a lecture to tell you that the world is really in trouble. But what's harder is figuring out how to stay engaged without burning out and shutting down or feeling like you're somehow just doing it wrong. And that's where Sarah Jaquette Ray comes in. She's a professor and chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt. She works at the intersection of social justice and climate emotions, particularly among youth activists and higher education. She serves on the board of the Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center and on the scientific advisory board for the Climate Mental Health Network. She speaks and publishes widely on the roles of emotions in climate anxiety, and she has taught mindfulness courses on climate and activism, and is a certified mindfulness teacher through the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. Her book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, has become a touchstone because it acknowledges that fear, grief, exhaustion, and even moments of numbness are not personal failures. They are reasonable responses to a world in polycrisis. And instead of just telling us to be more hopeful or to try harder, she offers tools for collective resilience, for boundaries, and for sustainable action over the long haul. Tonight's talk isn't about lowering the stakes, it's about how we are going to carry them together. And it's about figuring out how to care deeply and to stay human. So I am delighted to welcome someone who can help us imagine environmental engagement that's brave and honest and survivable. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Jaquette Ray.
All right, can you hear me okay? Yeah, sounds good. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see everybody here. What a beautiful auditorium this is. I lived in Corvallis for about 5 or 6 years, so this is like a homecoming for me. It's weird to feel that this place is like home to me. I hold it in this place in my memory that is deeply, almost sacred. It was where I lived where I went to graduate school down in Eugene, and spent a lot of time hanging out with the Beaver folks over here, and also just like don't even recognize the campus anymore. So there's all kinds of things that have absolutely happened since I left, and this is one of them. So thank you for having me in this space. I feel deeply honored to be able to come back. I haven't been back in a long time, and I got to walk to the top of Bald Hill today. Anybody love Bald Hill? Yeah. What a day. Oh my gosh. It's like this all the time here, right? I live in Arcata now, which is sort of like Oregon, more Oregon than California in my opinion. And I really miss Mary's Peak, so I was really enjoying seeing Mary's Peak as well. And the nostalgia is intense. I want to thank my old neighbors for coming out. Are my neighbors here? Skip and Pam, are you here? Oh, there they are. My neighbors, Skip and Pam. Dan and Carla, are they here? Did Dan and Carla? No, didn't come. Okay, so my old neighbors. They came. They're so sweet. Took me out for dinner last night. So I feel very welcome to come back here. Some old colleagues and friends, and a big shout out to Erica Elliott, who is a birthday girl today. Where's Erica? There she is. So if you get a chance, just happy birthday. So I wanted to have a few caveats before I get started. I don't want anybody to leave this talk today thinking that I'm Pollyanna and that I want us to look at the crises that we're facing and the problems that we're having that keep rolling in day by day. It feels like every day. Don't exist, or that we're trying to look away from that. So I want to make sure that if there's an inclination for some turning in a different direction that you take as me asking you to not look at the problems, I want to make sure that that's not coming across. I would also say that much of what I'm offering today really, really works for me, and it's distilled from folks who have been through the hard times. So it's not new, invented information. I'm like pulling from social movement activism, pulling from social movement theory, and pulling from history, and pulling from different wisdom traditions, and all kinds of things. And then, of course, more new stuff like neuroscience and mindfulness stuff that's happening. So there's a kind of a hodgepodge of information in here. And what the sort of background to this is that I'm super interdisciplinary. So I come from this really interdisciplinary training. I actually have a religious degrees BA, and an American Studies MA, and then an environmental science studies and policy PhD from Oregon, just down the road. And this has allowed me and enabled me, and I've had great mentors to say, just run in whatever direction, pull whatever knowledge comes together. And my background was in environmental justice and the environmental humanities before, and then around 2014, 2015 or so, this is sort of how things started to change for me. So, yeah, it wasn't going well. I was teaching all this stuff in my classes about how terrible things were because I had been trained in an era of time when environmental studies was about teaching young people how bad things are. And I still think that scare to care pedagogy is oftentimes the mainstream. Students in the house, how many classes have you been in where it's like, things are terrible, you need to know about it? Yeah, look at all those hands. That is a lot of hands. And certainly anybody older than you has had that if they've taken an environmental class. That's a lot of hands. So the scare to care pedagogy, I had a kind of moment of awakening when I had students sort of falling apart in my classes, not even coming to class, turning around and saying, I don't want to be an environmental studies major, it's too depressing, all this kind of stuff. I thought, this isn't working, we got to change something. And this was at the kind of beginning of people starting to think maybe the doom and gloom is actually having a backfiring effect. And there started to be a lot of internal agonizing in the field about maybe we shouldn't do doom and gloom for students, is that not working? So this was the beginning of that for me. And I'll share with you a little bit more of that. But yeah, I mean, part of what I really love about this particular comic, this comic, is that there's a sense of like, the therapy room is not where this is gonna get resolved, right? The stuff that's happening outside, you can't just get some internal adjustment or do some CBT to get rid of. Do you know what I mean? So like, it's kind of folly, right? I love about this comic is pointing out the folly of saying your mental health as young people or your mental health as anybody needs to be taken into the private space of a one-on-one therapy session and handled individually. That these are really collective problems that we are not going to be able to handle individually at all. However, I also want to say there is a lot we can do, right? So we don't want to swing too far on the spectrum and say, well, these structural problems are so big and they're outside, I can't touch them. I can't stop, that building from burning right there, right? I can't stop the wildfires from happening in LA, whatever. I can't stop this thing from happening that's happening out of the White House right now. Those kinds of things oftentimes make young people in particular, but me too, feel really disempowered, right? Like, I can't touch it, I can't do it, this problem's too big. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about this and let's talk a little bit more. So we kind of wanna have this like happy place in the middle where we have some agency to affect the things around us, and also the things that we're doing are pushing something at that structural level. So I also wanna have this caveat that I don't want you to go away from this talk thinking, I'm only individualizing the problem and everybody should just go deal with it in their therapy rooms. Okay, that's definitely not what I'm saying. And this is also something that I remember I had a boss at the time, not my current boss, I won't throw him under the bus, but my boss at the time, when I told him that I was spending so much time trying to pick my students off the floor of their existential despair, he was like, just send them to CAPS. Get them, send them to counseling and psychology services. Send them over there. Like, as if we have enough counselors on our campus. I don't know about OSU, but on our campus, it's like 1 per 1,000 or something. It's like the statistics in the CSU are really bad on this one. And so it dawned on me that if what we're teaching in our classes is something to do with the mental health of our students, and it's not just something happening outside, like in your social media, like, oh, these students are coming in, there's a youth mental health crisis, and they're coming into their classrooms, so they need to go to more CAPS. No, what we're teaching in our classes, we're teaching them about what's happening in the world. They're learning, actually, the majority of young people learn about climate crisis from outside of class. Classes don't actually teach the majority, so there's really cool data on that. Young people are coming into the classroom already pretty informed about how bad things are, right? And then we're teaching more of it. And so, yeah, there's a sense of like, oh, maybe there's something in the classroom that has to do with young people's mental health. So this was all kind of my awakening, a little bit of my awakening story I wanted to share with you. Okay, so I was having this moment where I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to observe my students. What's going on? Like a good scientist, I wanted to figure out how are they presenting in the classroom? What's going on, and how can I get my arms around this and figure out what they need? So one of the things that I was noticing is that young people in my classes could feel that there was no good they could do for the planet, only impact. So for example, they would be taking in their AP Environmental Science class, the ecological footprint activity. Has anyone ever taken that? Yeah, a lot of you, okay. Yeah, so the ecological footprint activity, for those of you who aren't aware of it, is this sort of test you can take where you calculate how many Earths you would need to support your lifestyle. So it calculates how much meat you eat per week, how you travel, this kind of stuff. And the effect of understanding their entire lives, like every email they send as having a carbon footprint, made many of my students feel like there was nothing good they could contribute, only negative impact, right? Everything they calculated through impact, and the nihilistic endpoint of that is not pretty, right? Like, maybe I shouldn't be here, is kind of where my students were going with that. Many of them feel all of humanity sucks, right? They're learning in a lot of their classes, kind of shorthand for the bad stuff some humans are doing to the planet is humanity, right? This kind of sweeping, like myopic thing about just all of humans are bad. And this was happening in a lot of their environmental science classes too, and I was probably participating in it, like humans have done this to nature, oh gosh, right? So this has caused a lot of my students anyway to get kind of swept up in what some theorists call the misanthropic temptation, which is just to hate humans, right? To hate all of the things that humans do. And this is kind of related to thinking of all humans as evil, right? Humans can't do good, they can't do good, all of humanity sucks. They often felt alone and kind of crazy in the kind of intensity of their emotions. This was obviously before there became a lot of language around this too, around calling things like climate anxiety and that sort of thing. Without the language to describe how young people were feeling about the environment and what was happening in the news and what they were getting on their social media, it was really isolating, right? And I cannot tell you how many students have come to me and said, I have a therapist or my counselor or somebody said to me, you pay too much attention to the news, just stop paying attention to the news. So again, to that comic in the beginning, the folly of somehow we can just put our heads down and ask young people to just ignore what's happening. The problems are too big and interconnected to solve. In other words, nothing that they do matters and nothing that matters is doable. I'm going to talk about this one quite a bit today. This sense of like, we're past the point of no return. That 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report, basically put a climate clock that said if we don't turn things around in 12 years, we're doomed, right? There's like a line in the sand, right? And that was 2018. So this was starting to happen even later than when I was, this sort of like, we're inevitably going down this path and we can't turn it around. This is actually, this last bullet point I just put up is something that Frederick Jameson and lots of other folks have talked about in terms of most Americans, or most people in fact, but there's research that studies the sort of uniqueness of how this plays out in American culture, can imagine an apocalyptic end of the world, like something out of the Terminator or something, more than they can imagine something better like, oh, I don't know, a post-fossil fuel society or future. Which seems like the one is way more likely than the other, right? Like, doesn't it seem like it's more likely we'll get to post-fossil fuel than it would be to have a full-on Terminator apocalypse? I don't know. I feel like it's weird that we have that. This turns out, when I started to study things like cognitive biases and stuff, this has to do with something that social psychologists and neuroscientists will call the availability bias. Has anybody ever heard of that? A little obscure. Or maybe one or two people, yeah. The availability bias basically says oh, hi. Is that supposed to be on me? Hide. Okay. I was enjoying being able to see everybody, but I think that's probably better for you all. Okay. Okay. The availability bias is this concept that you can imagine the limits of your imagination about what can happen in the future is directly related to what you can most easily retrieve in your memory. And so if you've just watched Don't Look Up, or if you've just watched LA Burn, or you've just watched some awful thing, that is what your imagination constrains you to for what you think can happen in the future. That's just a cognitive bias. So these kinds of cool things about biases, about how they stop us from actually building the world that we desire, is something I want to talk about a little bit today. They feel that their life course is unclear and it won't be like previous generations. There's data that shows this, so they're not crazy for thinking this. And they even feel like it's going to be cruel to bring children into the world. And I'm not trying to promote bringing children into the world. I'm not a pronatalist, don't get me wrong. But there is a sort of interesting thing that's happened where the reproductive refusal of this generation is quite different than the reproductive refusal of folks who are environmentalist hippies in the 70s, right? That was about, I don't want to consume. That was like, no impact, right? And so now this idea that I don't want to bring a child into the world because they're going to live in an uninhabitable planet is quite a different reason. And maybe a little bit more immediate, right? And to this point about nihilism I mentioned earlier, right? They don't even want to show up to class. Like we're asking these people, we're saying, all of our hope is in you, young people. Great, thank you so much. It feels like terrible to hear that, right? The amount of times young people have said to me, I'm sick and tired of you telling me that I give you hope, right? It's so potent. It's like, wow, that pressure. Thanks for that pressure, Sarah. Oh, geez, right. So yeah, no wonder they don't want to come to class. And oftentimes, if you look at the data of American youth, around the world, there's an incredible amount of young people who are very concerned about climate change, but actually the number for American youth is significantly lower. Right? And I sort of think this is related to how insulated American youth are from this. It's related to the way we politicize climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can come up with all kinds of theories, but the point is, denial is a lot easier than having to face that when it feels so overwhelming in all these ways. So just to give you a flavor of like the kinds of feelings my students were feeling, this was Valentine's coming up. I'll get to that. We're going to end on love, just a little tidbit there. But yeah, this is Valentine's Day card from my class. That year that I was like, maybe I'm doing things wrong. Oh boy. Yeah, it was done in a loving, funny way, and we all laughed about it, but it was one of those moments where I was like, maybe we're not doing this right. This is what we're doing to our students, right? Okay, they're artsy. Okay, so it's not just my students. I started writing a field guide to climate anxiety for students because of that piece of art you just saw there and my perplexity about how to deal with my students. And just as I was doing page proofs on that, Greta Thunberg came on the scene. And I was like, what? This isn't just my students in Humboldt, our little bubble. This is like youth around the whole world? What? That's so crazy, right? It was so amazing to me. Oh, and then the data started coming out. People started doing mass data on this, okay? So the sources are at the bottom there. Nearly 85% of about the 16,000 people that were surveyed in the first data set in about, I think it was about this is the American one, sorry, this is 2024. In 50 states said they felt moderately worried, and 58% said they felt worried or extremely worried. The global study from 2021 had more than 45% of 10,000 young people said they had feelings of climate change that affected their daily lives. 3/4 of them said that they thought the future was frightening. Over half say they think humanity is doomed. It's painful. About 1/4 of them say that climate change is the reason they will not have children. This isn't to say that generationally it makes most sense to think about youth as the only ones who care about climate change. That's not at all what I'm saying. Skip and Pam right here, examples. Care a lot about climate change. It's really cool to go talk to intergenerational groups and have all this stuff going on since I wrote the book, but I'm paying attention to the kids in my class, right? This is what made me then write a field guide to climate anxiety for young people, but that happened right in 2020. Some stuff was going on around the world, if you recall that time. Maybe you were, I don't know, 2020, it's not that long ago, 5 years ago. So a bunch of educators were in total crisis and wanted to put together a book about it too. So that's the educator book there too that we kind of built for educators specifically. Okay, so a little temperature check on you. One of the amazing contributors to that book about teachers created this really cool graphic, and I'm hoping that you can kind of read some of it. In the back, can you read it? A little bit? No? Okay. All right, I'll do a little bit of reading of this. So the outside circle of this is what I want you to take a look at. It is in the category that says beliefs up there. And in these beliefs, you have things like, I feel guilty for indulging in pleasures that I know are part of the problem. And so I'm just asking you, if you can read it, or as you're listening to me, to kind of think which one of these statements kind of captures where you feel, maybe today. Not all the time, but just today. It's easier. How about, I need to fight if my community and I are going to survive. I feel furious that we continue harming our planet. I'm terrified about the future. I'm anxious about the next wildfire season. It's too much to think about, let alone do anything about. The planet is better off without us. Anybody want to share, if they can read it, where they're feeling today? I have to get through the light here to see. Yeah.
I'm definitely anxious about the next wildfire season.
Thank you. Yeah, anybody else agree? Yes. Yeah. We're over here in the west. Yeah, we got it down there too. Anybody else?
All of the above.
All of the above. Yeah, right? Don't want to pick one. Good. What I love about this graphic is that this person has helped us see that the beliefs, these statements and the quote marks on the outside circle are really affected by our nervous systems. And what do I mean by that? I mean that while we're going around the world, a bunch of stimulus is coming at us. We are taking in what Thich Nhat Hanh would call nutriments, sort of like nutrients, not a typo. So nutriments are coming into our sense doors, as they would say in mindfulness circles, right? We're hearing stuff. We're looking at our phone. We're having a thought even, counts as that. We're encountering different sounds and sights and feelings and tastes and scents and all that. And it's making us have certain kinds of responses in our body. Everybody's really different. A slamming door might feel one way to somebody. It feels very different to somebody else. The beliefs that they have about what's happening with the slamming door might be radically different. So I'm not trying to homogenize the experience of all these emotions at all. Right? So we get all this information coming in. Then you mix that up with all of our backgrounds and how we're raised and all of our experiences in life and our genetics and the environment, blah, blah, blah. And you have all kinds of possibilities here of what our beliefs come out to be. Whether we perceive a sense that we're experiencing as something to be afraid of. Whether the story we're telling ourselves about some stimulus that we're getting is something to be anxious about or to be joyful about. Right? We're telling ourselves these stories based on all of these different things, right? So what I love about that is it brings all these beliefs down to the nervous system and it helps us see that the beliefs that we're having they're stories that we're telling ourselves, which means we can actually do work to live in different stories in order to help our nervous systems be equipped for what we got to do. And this is kind of the spirit of where I'm going today. So this is my favorite response in the wheel. Can anybody remember which fight, flight, or flight response this one is? It's like a test. It's a test, yeah. Thank you, winner. I love that, yes. Okay, this one's dissociation. This is my favorite. Who likes dissociation in this room? I'm a big fan, big fan. Dissociation, right? This kind of like, it's so overwhelming that I gotta go and do something else. I can't think about it. Can't think about it right now. What I also find very poignant about this comic is that it sort of has this intergenerational vibe, like the older person is trying to share their love of nature maybe with the younger person. That's how I'm interpreting it. And this younger person, I think the person who wrote this comic was trying to criticize young people for being into their tech, right? Is that the first reading you get? But I also get this like, this kid how can you put this information on this kid, right? The information about the sea levels rising and the refugees and the whales, right? This kid this is like overwhelming existentially for this kid. And I have full, profound empathy for why they might want their iPod back. And the funny thing is that the iPod now is like retro, so it's not really, you know what I mean? But anyway, it was a moment, okay? We can say iPad or whatever you want to put in the blank, but we'll come back to it. Okay, the first big claim I want to make, and it kind of backwards designs from that graphic we just looked at, is that emotions shape our climate capacity. Okay, let me unpack this a little bit. First of all, and this is coming out of all kinds of research, so this shouldn't be unfamiliar to many of you, emotions dictate our decision-making and ability to build community and our ability to have responsible actions, and that's not a typo, that's like looking at mindfulness language, that when we have a stimulus that comes in our sense door, we either react or we respond, and the idea of responding has to do with taking that pause and having a wise response rather than just reacting, right? And so it also implies responsibility. I like that too. Ability to engage in meaningful work despite setbacks. All this stuff requires emotions that are enabling us to do that. A lot of folks think, and I think it's a very kind of like Cartesian enlightenment dualism, or you can just say Western viewpoint, that our thinking and our brains and our thoughts are running the show. And facts dictate people's decision making. Well, I guess we can dispense with that delusion at this point, right? And there's also really important research that shows that. That particular first point, there's like so much books to cite for that, but I'm just going to leave it at that. Secondly, the science of emotions shows that different emotions shape climate action in really different ways. And to the extent that we can, maybe we want to be strategic about that. So I do an activity with my students where I have them take a look at an emotions wheel and I say, which one of these emotions makes you want to get up in the morning and engage in climate action? And which one of these emotions would make you feel like staying in bed? And it's a little bit of like a red herring activity. Obviously, it's really complicated. There's not just one clear answer, but at least it gets our conversation going about paying attention to our interior life and how it shapes whether or not we're going to get up in the morning and do something. And there's some interesting research out there too about whether or not things like guilt or anger or love or all these different emotions can motivate long-term action, especially in the face of something like burnout, right? So climate and environmental workers in all kinds of spaces, and there's really cool research on this, are like really burned out, right? They don't see the outcomes of their efforts. They're like Sisyphus pulling the boulder up the hill. Nothing's going on. It just seems like bad news around every corner. This results in a lot of burnout, right? If you don't see the results of your actions. So which kinds of emotions do we want to, this was my first question with my students was, okay, what emotions do they need to feel by the end of my class to go out and go save the world? What do you think? What emotion? What's the holy grail emotion? Connection? Motivation? Love? Health? Did somebody say health? Hope, yeah, right. Oh, I thought it was hope for a while. I studied hope deeply. I don't know. All of the above. Who said all the above before? Yeah. Anger gets in there. There's all kinds of stuff, right? But too much anger, right? We've seen also a lot of research on this. Too much anger can actually undermine us, right? So going back to nervous systems turned out to be a really good way to kind of figure out the question to that. But for example, guilt. If you feel, If you feel guilt at the end of doing the ecological footprint, the research shows that you're likely to change your behavior for about 6 weeks. Maybe that's the emotion we want from our AP environmental science students? I don't know. I don't think so. So I was like, guilt, that's not a good one. Just the point about thinking about guilt, because environmentalism often likes to try to get guilt out of its audiences, right? Okay, so a third reason, the suppression of uncomfortable emotions or difficult emotions, which in a Western context I would name as things like grief and anger, just fuels the problem more, often contributing to further fraying of relationships among humans and between humans, and certainly between humans and the more than human world. So for example, if you're on the receiving end of this terrible information and you just want your iPod back, you are going to get your iPod pad back, and you're going to maybe swipe and buy some stuff and oh, thank you, Amazon, you came into the rescue right when I needed you because I was feeling kind of despairing about the planet. Purchase, right? So just the ways that suppressing uncomfortable emotions can lead us to do destructive behavior in our own lives. We've probably felt that. Maybe, even had some funky coping mechanisms yesterday or today or something, I don't know. And then also makes us maybe do things that are not good for the environment too. It's just inviting us to think about all the ways that suppressing uncomfortable emotions may or may not serve what we're actually here for. Also, I want to point out that folks that are in more climate justice and environmental justice worlds will ask us to pay much more close attention to our bodies and our hearts, and not just be in the mind. And so by advocating for an emotions-centered approach, or for a bodily-centered approach, or somatic-centered approach to climate work, I am also in alignment, or trying to be in alignment, with folks who are arguing more for a justice-centered approach. And we can talk in Q&A or afterwards about why that might be. And this is the one that got me thinking about my students, right? Their mental health, their capacity, their interior lives is shaping whether they can do this work. Right? And so then I started to get more language around this, and this is why I learned about things like the social work phrase, hurt people, and I would say hurt people, hurt the planet, right? This kind of, if we're not doing this healing stuff, we don't show up 150% to do the other work that we want to do. It gets in the way. So this is why I love Paul Hawkins' quote, "The most radical climate technology is a heart and mind, not a solar panel." I live by this quote. It's yes. I like solar panels too, don't get me wrong. But you know what I mean? We don't think of the heart and mind. We don't think of our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions and how our bodies are doing as a climate technology. And what if we did? What if we thought of it as a climate technology? What would that do? We could enlist all of the sciences of emotions and minds and brains in service of the climate. When we think about climate science, we don't think about neuroscience, right? So there's some prejudices there that we still have yet to overcome. Claim 2, our nervous systems respond to the story that we choose to live in, right? I put choose to in there for a reason. Does anybody know what this is? This room should know. Yeah, what is that?
It's the climate stripes. The climate stripes, Ed Hawkins' climate stripes.
Yes, thank you. So this piece of art that's called the warming stripes, and is supposed to represent the last couple hundred years of the Earth's temperature, average temperature. You'll see it on ties, stuff like that. People wear it to represent climate. And what I want to point out about this is that even something as simple as this piece of art or this representation of bars of color has an implicit architecture to its story. And this goes back to my English narrative roots here, which is very Spring Creek Project-esque. So what's happening? What's the architecture of this story? Joanna Macy, has anybody heard of Joanna Macy in the group? Yeah, kind of just passed away last year. Bless her soul. Amazing eco-Buddhist activist for a long, long time. Had a bunch of activities and something called The Work That Reconnects, and many books about hope and stuff. And in her work that Reconnect, she has an activity called the Stories of Now, and she's trying to help people understand how the story that they live in affects their behavior. So another caveat, all of the things I'm saying are, quotable. There's like citations. I'm not making any of this stuff up. So Joanna Macy talks about living in the story of the Great Unraveling, what she calls the Great Unraveling. And we know what that story is, right? I just have to put like one image up and you know what I'm talking about, the doom-scrolling story of how terrible things are. That reflects the negativity bias in the news, but neuroscientists would even go as far as to say that that is actually a result of a deeper cause, which is a negativity bias in our brains, which is, Rick Hansen, the neuroscientist, says, your brains are like Teflon for good information and like Velcro for bad, which I know to be true because of my course evaluations every semester. Anybody? Teachers in the house? You know what I'm talking about? Right, like the one person that said that one thing, right? So there's this negativity, and that's evolutionary. People will say that it's evolutionary. We have that for good reason. We're scanning the horizon for the saber-toothed tiger, so it's really good that we pay attention to the saber-toothed tiger and not the sunflower that's so pretty. But this is evolutionary, another bias, a negativity bias that doesn't serve us in this moment, right, for the most part. And just being aware of how it operates on us is a really good, important first step. But I want to kind of pan out a little bit and think about how it shapes the news world that we live in. So it creates this kind of loop, right? Like our negativity bias in our brains creates the supply, the demand creates the supply. Elon Musk and Bezos are all very happy to give us all that, right? Whatever gets our eyeballs, if it bleeds, it leads, just take all that negativity, consume, and then we start to live in this world of the Great Unraveling just by virtue of that phenomenon. That might be oversimplified, but I want to kind of go down a small segue here. I won't spend too much time on it. That this negativity bias in the news is documented, and it has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. And one could say that it tracks with the corporatization of media, which is only getting worse by the day. And it tracks with how people are getting their news, which is increasingly now more and more through social media than news. So that means that the attention economy is what's driving the news people are mostly consuming, which is really something to think about. Kind of background, right? But like just checking out how those emotions, I'll let you absorb that. Okay, so what's happening in the Great Unraveling? One is that there's a trope of inevitability. We can do nothing to stop it, it's God's will, it's natural. We've heard all those arguments about climate change for sure, from all sides of the political spectrum. There's a decline from an era of good times, a fall from grace, right? This sort of prelapsarian nostalgia for going back to the garden, right? There are unspecific actors. All of humanity is the culprit. There's a real pessimistic view of human nature. There's no evidence of progress. There's no pathways for solutions. There's no good people, right? What are the intended emotional effects of that story? Fear, resignation, right? Whose interest does it serve if we feel this way?
Oil companies.
Yeah, right? Certainly does not serve the planet's interest, ironically, right? So what does the story do to our capacity to respond? And I'm going to go back to our nervous systems for a minute here. Has anybody ever seen this concept of the window of tolerance or the range of resilience? Quite a few, yeah, quite a few. Okay, good. For those of you who are not familiar, this is a Dan Siegel concept. It's used a lot in trauma therapy, but also thinking about nervous systems and how they shape our actions and decision making. And I don't expect you to read all that, right? But going back to that circle with the fight, flight, or freeze, they're in there, okay? The concept here is that if our nervous systems feel regulated, we're inside what's called the window of tolerance or the range of resilience. And if we're in that, we can do things like have our prefrontal cortex fully locked in, our executive functioning is high, we can think about the future, we can think about the common good, we can think about empathy. There's all kinds of things we can do that when we're triggered and we're hyper or hypo-aroused, we just don't have access to. Anybody been hyper or hypo-aroused in the last 24 hours? Whew, stuff coming in our sense doors, kicking us up to hyper or hypo-aroused. And each of us responds really differently. Every one of us has a different range of tolerance. Everyone has our favorite go-to hypo or hypo-arousal thing, It's varying, very varying. If we've experienced a lot of trauma, for example, just to show this as an example, a lot of times that range of resilience can be very narrowed down and all kinds of stuff triggers us out of it. And we're not able to have our executive functioning and make decisions in service of like the larger good. We're just putting out the immediate fire right in front of us all the time. That's how that feels. If we do a lot of healing work, we can actually have really wonderfully robust ranges of tolerance, right? Windows of tolerance. So this is like the goal, right? If we're in our window of tolerance more and more and more, despite things getting worse and worse and worse, we're going to be way more, our capacity is going to be increased to respond in a wise way. What I love about this graphic too is that there's a reference to long-term focus versus short-term focus, and I think that's really key for something like climate change. If you are not right now having to evacuate your home, you might be thinking of climate change as some abstract thing that might happen in some sort of future thing. And it's really hard, as we know from the marshmallow experiments, it's really hard to do stuff now for some future abstraction, right? So it's all the more important if that's how we see climate change, if that's our experience with climate change, we're not in this moment having to do a short-term emergency, then tapping into a long-term focus will be really important. What else does it do? This is the second thing I want to point out. There's this concept in social psychology called pseudo-advocacy, which I think is really, really helpful, and I've had to practice it a lot to figure out how to say it fast in talks, so if I mess it up. The concept is that the idea that people are less likely to offer help if they think a problem is too big for them to solve. The positive feeling of solving even a small part is outweighed by the negative feeling of not being able to solve the whole. Climate change? Yeah, right? Climate change is framed as huge. Structural polycrisis, huge. And you too, you as an individual in Western individualistic society are framed as too small. All right, I often say to people, if you're suffering from climate despair, you're actually suffering from individualism. And we'll get to that in a minute. But pseudo-efficacy means the problem's too big and I feel too small. And they did a bunch of experiments with this, where they basically, it was like, if I don't think I can save the children drowning in like lots of different ponds, I'm not even going to save one child. No children were actually hurt in this. This was a theoretical experiment. But if you see yourself as only one person saving only one child at a time, of course you're going to feel like you can't even do it, right? So to me, this is an invitation to not just reframe climate change as much smaller, but to reframe ourselves as much bigger, and to go back to somebody's answer over here about connection, that is going to be about collectivity. We're going to get there. Okay, so how does all of this negativity bias stuff and everything conspire to help us from healing the earth? Okay, so just kind of like rehash what we just did. The negativity bias and feedback loop we talked about creates this perception that we're living in times of great unraveling, which causes these feelings of pseudo-efficacy, not maybe in all of us, right? I'm talking about sort of general sweeps here. And nervous system dysregulation, which often leads us without, if we're not aware of it, further actions that dysregulate us and harm us and the planet, and it becomes another feedback loop, right? So that's what I'm trying to point out if this is happening to you, right? Maybe it doesn't happen to you, but if it does, it happens to me. So how do we disrupt this self-fulfilling prophecy? Because of course, if we can only imagine the apocalypse and not a post-fossil fuel society, and we're living in the great unraveling, and that shapes our nervous system, so we just dissociate, right? We're not really equipped to create this other world that we might want. So we have to do all kinds of stuff that are not maybe intuitive, maybe against our cognitive biases, certainly way against what capitalism wants us to do, and maybe also against what Western culture that many of us are swimming in have wanted us to do. So it takes some like awareness of what's happening to you. How do we transform this distress that we feel into this engagement section of the pie down there, right? Connection, to the point that somebody made earlier. Okay, so I'm coming towards the last part of my talk here of 5 tools of collective resilience. This is just stuff I've researched. I mean, I appreciate anyone being like, oh, 5 tools, I have to go through this list, it's another thing to do. I'm not asking you to feel that way about it. I'm just trying to make it look snazzy for the purposes of a talk. Okay. 5 tools of collective resilience. Ideally, the reason I'm laying this out for you is to help us heal from and avoid burnout, and to feel resourced to face the polycrisis and its harms. The first is about paying attention to our attention. So in particular, I want to focus on paying attention to the stories that we live in, because that was what I just talked about with Joanna Macy's work. We can stave off the apocalypse, the actual apocalypse, and stave off feelings of isolation by paying attention to stories of solutions and collective power. Because here's what the neuroscientists tell you. Our brains really like it when we know we're not alone. We're way more likely to show up to something if we know someone else is going to be there, right? Class, for example. Our efforts are celebrated in community, right? Like if we feel like there's no results of our actions, we don't see it, we're less likely to want to keep going. So those efforts have to be celebrated. We had a win here, we had a win here, we had a win here. Your effort matters, right? And there's a really cool book out there, if you want to check it out, called The Psychology of Collective Climate Action, which talks about this sort of tension between a sense of collective efficacy, like we as a big group are going to make big changes, and this sort of tension with personal efficacy. I as an individual need to feel I matter, right? We can't just have one or the other, in my opinion, right? And also this is cultural for me too. I acknowledge that it reflects the culture I was raised in. Okay, so what's the alternative? Joanna Macy offers us a different story, and I'm inviting us to think about how we might be able to pay more attention to these kinds of stories around us. They just don't make the news as much. She calls it the great turning. The archetype is that the future is ours to make. It's not inevitable. Better worlds are possible, not the apocalypse, right? This is why you have Arundhati Roy saying, on a quiet day, I can hear that world breathing. Or why you have Valerie Carr after the 2016 presidential election saying, maybe the darkness we're in is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb. Right? People are asking for a rethink around transformation, not apocalypse. This movement of helpers exists, and I'm using, of course, Mr. Rogers' mom's quote here. Anybody heard that quote? Mr. Rogers, how do you keep going when everything's so bad for children? Oh, my mom told me to look for the helpers. I'm not trying to belittle Mr. Rogers' mom or Mr. Rogers here, but that's like how that conversation went, right? This like, look for the helpers, right? When we start to actually pay attention to all of the people who are doing this work, it is quite overwhelming. If we spend every single day of our lives with those people, you breathe a different oxygen. And you're building in your local place that better universe than the one that you fear. So this movement of helpers exists, and this idea that there's going to be one hero, Greta Thunberg is going to save us, right? No, it's not going to happen. Not going to be one hero. This awareness of a collective, right? Like we're in a choir singing, and maybe if I get tired, I can take a breath, and the rest of the choir keeps going, the song keeps going. Oh, I can rest. I'm going to come back when I can. Right? Instead of this like, I gotta save the world right now, I gotta do it tomorrow, and then I can have the margarita on the beach. Probably not how it's gonna go down, right? It reduces individualism and alienation, right? This awareness of the collective, super important. Specific people are to blame, right? This is not all of humanity sucking. This is some specific people that we can take to task and change. It's not that easy, obviously, but it's a little easier than changing all of humanity, which feels really impossible. There's just as much as evidence that people do good things as bad. So I'm just thinking right now about all of my indigenous colleagues telling me all the time, hello, we've been doing great things for the environment for time immemorial, right? 80% of biodiversity is on the 5% of indigenous lands. Right? When we erase or ignore or don't acknowledge that some communities actually increase biodiversity, increase resilience to climate change, we actually make their work really hard to do. So again, celebrating the people who are doing that stuff and saying, hey, humans can be really good over here. Check it out. Examples of the great turning are not going to make the news, right? Like I had somebody tell me, I realized after I heard your talk, Sarah, that I'm finding the examples of the great turning in like my Seed magazine, right? It's like not prominent news sources, because those prominent news sources are designed to make you feel small, ineffectual, powerless, and like the world's going inevitably down a slippery slope. I mentioned this about the womb, not the tomb, right? This sort of reframe of the story, this moment of history that we're in. What are the intended emotional effects of the story? Of course, right? They're really different than the Great Unraveling. In general, right? In general. We can't always live in the Great Turning. Maybe I try to live in it 5 days a week, and the other 2 I'm in the Great Unraveling. I don't know, whatever, you figure it out. The second thing is to be less right and more in relation. This is the name of a chapter in my book, and it's really riffing off the work of Adrienne Maree Brown. So there's also a really cool book that's just come out called Don't Talk About Politics, which talks about social infrastructure and how much we need social infrastructure to do this work. If we see that we are not alone in the work, this liberates us from powerlessness and despair and can repair the root of both our planetary and psychic problems. And I'm referring here to Kyle Powys White's beautiful work, the Potawatomi climate philosopher who talks about how the origin of our problems with climate change are not industrialization, but actually colonization, 1492, the moment of rupture when people came here and said, this is going to be the relationship that we have with the more than human world. Extraction, objectification, commodification. So repairing relationships. That's like, I'm really skipping over that one, but you could spend some time with that one. I really like this one too. Like, can we just work with our brains a little bit better? Can we think about how our biases are getting in the way of us doing this work? Turns out our brains are wired really primarily for 2 big things, connection and pleasure. Somebody even called our brains pleasure-seeking machines, which is like, a brain, it's a machine, whoa. Right? How can we make this climate work that we're trying to do pleasurable? How can we make sure there's connection in there? Because people will show up a whole lot more if that's that going on, right? This is why you have that amazing quote, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of this revolution, right? Or people, I remember I had students in 2015 go to the climate marches, and they came back and they were like, people were happy and they were drumming and dancing and singing and playing, and it didn't seem like they were taking the reason for being here seriously enough. We're like trying to stop oil, and they're like dancing in the streets. And it was a real aha moment for me, and I think for them too, to think if you want to bring about a world where everybody can dance and sing and feel joyful, you darn well better start practicing that right now. Take care of yourself, right? How you show up and what you do matters. I sometimes feel like my students, if they don't even believe what they do matters, then none of the rest of the stuff matters that I'm saying, right? Like we got to start with, do you actually believe that you matter? Because we can't really do any of this other stuff without starting there. Your nervous system shapes these relationships, right? Shapes this work. And of course, Audre Lorde's amazing quote, self-care is an act of warfare, right? Like it's a strategic political thing. It's not something that takes away from the collective work. And I think for the most part, this is an epiphany that young people get, right? I'm seeing this in my students. And finally, if we go back to this question of the attention economy and living and trying to find examples of the Great Turning, what we're really talking about, going back to emotions, is this emotion of love, I think. Somebody mentioned love. And it is actually Valentine's Day coming up, so I really want to end on love here. Turns out, for the most part, love is a very replenishing emotion. Okay? It's not like, oh, we need to love thy neighbor. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, oh, I need to love these people who are doing these awful things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when we think there's a monster under our beds, we can spend our whole time trying to fight the monster to get rid of the monster. But usually that kind of fear and anxiety and anger is a secondary emotion that can point us to something that we love. What are we afraid of? I'm really afraid of a planet where my kids can't grow up and breathe clean air. Right? I'm just going to fill in an example, like fill in the blank. What are we afraid of? That fear about that monster in the bed usually can take us to something that we love, that we're afraid is going to get hurt by the monster under the bed. We can spend a lot of energy putting attention and soil and light and water on the monster in the garden. I'm mixing my metaphors here. Right? You follow me? Follow me? Like there's the bramble, it's the monster, we don't want it there. Himalayan blackberry, you know what I'm talking about. And then the stuff we want to grow, I don't know, blueberries, chard. What do you want to grow? Lupin is over here like getting neglected, right? So oftentimes when I get really despairing, like when I'm in my deepest dark times of great unraveling, which is every day, okay, I'm gonna be honest. This is my go-to lifeline. Where around me, right around me, as I'm feeling dysregulated and I can't think beyond my immediate fire in front of me, where is something that I love that I can nurture with this energy? This angst, this energy, this anger. Oh my God, that thing I love that this terrible monster in the room is threatening is right here, and I can tend to it. So I'm talking about love as a strategy, a political strategy. I'm not talking about love like love thy neighbor, right? About tapping the emotions that are most likely to sustain us for the work. People have theorized about love. It's February 14th coming up, so I have to spend some time. People have theorized a lot about love as an effective political emotion. Bell hooks, if you're thinking about this and want to go buy some great books. Adrian Brown's beautiful book, Loving Corrections. Of course, Cornel West talks about justice is what love looks like in public. And similarly, this is what I really think was happening on Sunday. Anybody watch the Super Bowl halftime show? Yeah. Seahawks fan too, I gotta admit, sorry. So that kind of helped. But what happened here was radical, in my opinion. So that's love. So, ending on this slide, to try to make it applicable and give you that checklist. How might you integrate these tools into your own life and disrupt that cycle? How can you choose to live in the great turning, where the future is yet to be determined? How can you unlearn individualism and build social connection? How can you work with your brain's default wiring to seek reward, to be connected, and maybe work to undo some of the other biases? How can you take responsibility for your nervous system? How can you feed what you want to grow? How can you divest your attention from the attention economy and the great unraveling and pour it into the things that you love? So that's it. Thank you so much. I wanted to wrap with a couple of questions from students. From a sustainability, justice, and engagement class, students sent in some really great questions, and I was asked to pick a few and answer them. And I will pick just one for the sake of time. How has my experience with climate anxiety changed the trajectory of my career? And I would say that there was a time there where I very much felt like I didn't want to pay attention to climate change. It was too big. I was absolutely caught up in all those same default mechanisms, all my cognitive biases. It wasn't until my students could not do what was in class, and I felt it was my job to make them happy, active people in the world. Maybe too much pressure. I remember having like a profound moment of burnout and despair where it actually made me resent my students. It was not a pretty moment for me. When I felt like I can't make them happy. I cannot take carbon out of the atmosphere for them. I cannot reverse elections for them. And I had this moment of my own limitations of what I could do, my own hero narrative I was carrying around with me, and wanting to be of service to them, right? Like, there's got to be people who've been through hard times like this and have something to offer. And it completely changed everything. When I started researching these questions, what do my students need? What is the emotional landscape of this stuff that we're teaching them? What is going on? What are the interface of politics, climate politics, and emotions? How can we get farmers in Idaho to get on board with climate change, right? It's emotions. It's just been like a layer and peeling of the onion. It's an infinite dive into incredible research people are doing around social movements, around emotions, around neuroscience. And youth activists are doing all that work too. They're figuring it all out too. So yeah, it's been a really fabulous turn. And I'd say oftentimes when I'm talking to people who have never thought about climate emotions and that you could tell they're just starting to think about it and they're putting two and two together with me, I think to myself, gosh, what a journey it's been, because I'm in a completely different place now after researching all this stuff. And I would say that feed what you want to grow thing and the different tools, the reason I'm sharing them with you is because they're what works for me. And I'm a little bit heady. I'm more in my head than actually in my body usually, actually, even though I said earlier that we should think about bodies. But I'm an academic. And so all this research has really done a lot of healing work for me. And then I also did a lot of healing work. So I've done a lot of work on repairing that. And I had a moment where I thought, I care so much about the planet. I care so much about my children. I care so much about my students. I care so much about justice. And I am diminishing my capacity to meet the moment every time I pay attention to bad stuff, every time I have too much to drink the night before, every time I cope with some really unhealthy strategies. And so it was a real moment of awakening for me where I said, I want to be 150% for the stuff I love. I want to have my window of tolerance as capacious as it can be for all the stuff I want to show up for. And I think that is actually going to matter. I deluded myself into believing that it matters. And that's where I am now. So it's not just changed my career, but, and I could talk about that. Career stuff is like, I'm just doing this now. This is, whether you call this my career or not, it's not really what my profession would have me do. I like, meditate with students and stuff like that. It's a little different than what I thought I was getting into. But that has changed really my demeanor and the way I show up for this work. So yeah, I love that question. Thank you very much for sticking around to listen to that. And I think I will leave it at just that one question. And thank you so much for all your attention. Really nice to talk to you.